Hey everybody, welcome to the Bright Muse. My Bright Muse today is Dr. Matthew Harper. He is a associate professor of history and Africana studies at Mercer University. Thanks for coming on today, Matt.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So you have a very interesting vocation and interesting knowledge, and I could probably talk to you for a very long time, but we're going to try to keep it within our time constraint here.
Okay.
So we'll just get right into it. What got you? What about your past and your personal history got you into this particular vocation today?
Well, I grew up in post-civil rights Southern communities in East Texas and North Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
And those communities, the schools were integrated, but little else was. The churches that we went to were segregated. The friend groups were segregated. The people my parents knew, the people my parents didn't know. It all fell along racial lines. And I remember growing up asking a lot of questions, like why is it like this? Why do I notice that Black people live on one part of town, white people live on another? Or that why do my parents know the parents of the other white students, but they don't know the parents of the Black friends that I have in class? Or and then being also to notice that there was a resource difference between the two, right? That the Black side of town had fewer resources. Those houses were in worse repair. What was going on? Why was this happening? And I asked a lot of questions, and was surrounded by a lot of loving and well-meaning adults who told me, oh, it used to matter, but it doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah.
And we're all fine now. But I could look around myself and say, it's not over. Race seemed to be the governing principle for the communities I lived in. There was nothing else that explained social life or economic life in the towns that I grew up in better than race. Race predicted, who you would vote for, what church you went to, what friend groups you would be in, what side of the town you were hanging out on. It determined everything. But I wasn't getting answers from people. So I started reading. And I said,
How old? About?
I think I was about 8 when I started asking these questions. And I know that my mom used to take us to a bookstore in Texarkana, Texas, and say, pick out any book that you want. And my sister picked out fiction. And I went straight to the history books and started grabbing works on African-American history, Civil War history, civil rights history, trying to make sense of the world that I was in.
Yeah. So you're an observant and compassionate and curious child.
Well, I wasn't sure. It was one of the things that just popped right out to me. I had early on as a kid, I just noticed that, I was lucky, I think, to grow up in small enough communities where the schools, there weren't multiple school systems, or where there weren't private schools in suburbs that had pulled a lot of the white kids out. I grew up in schools that were probably 55% white, 40% Black, 5% other. So it wasn't something that was easy to ignore.
Yeah.
I was seeing it. And so I kept checking out books until I got a PhD in African American studies. That was that's what happened for me. And as I did, it made so much sense of my world. As I read that, I grew up in public schools in the South. And public schools in the South only exist because former slaves demanded them after the end of the Civil War. And so the world that I lived in, the schools I went to, were there because of African-American history. It was, to learn African-American history wasn't really about studying someone else's story. It told me so much about my own story. So it's really an autobiographical hunt. It's that I couldn't really understand my world unless I went to the churches on the other side of town, unless I learned about what was going on that was hidden from me. And I think also as a Christian, I had been exposed to people who were really good at showing me the heart of Jesus. But the heart of Jesus was really concerned with justice, right? Really concerned with the people in society who were cast out to the margins, who were, and yet the same churches that took me to the heart of Jesus seemed to have a really high tolerance for injustice in their own communities. Didn't really seem to bother anybody that there was a whole class of people who were being denied access to resources, and so
So you saw a big disconnect.
yeah, I did. I was like, well, how I could, the politics of the churches that I went to didn't match the theology that they were sharing with me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I felt a little homeless for a while, until I started studying Black theology. And then I found a theology that really resonated with the theology I grew up with, very close
Okay.
to that theology, but that one that took seriously Jesus's demand for justice, for a God who intervened on behalf of the oppressed and took up his lot with the outcast and the marginalized. And that really opened me up and made more sense of my life. So I think a lot of my academic pursuit has really been autobiographical.
Uh-huh. Okay. And how did, as you were growing up living, under someone else's roof, how did the adults in your life feel about you're pushing this,
Oh, well, yes. So they were really, they sometimes were baffled. I was learning things that they had not been told.
Sure.
My parents had been told a version of their past which justified the oppression of African Americans, and they wouldn't wanted to continue that oppression, but they hadn't been told another story. Mm-hmm. They had been miseducated. So when I was coming home and learning new things, they were interested, intrigued, thought it was curious. Nobody else in our community's kids were doing this, but there was never any resistance. I never got any pushback. They were always like, okay, that sounds great. I can imagine a lot of people would have gone to their families and said, well, I'm decided to major in history. I'm going to get a doctorate in African-American history. And a lot of people were like, no, you're not. I had friends actually who pursued what they were passionate in, and their parents said, no, do something practical instead.
Or just feeling a little threatened, maybe, as a parent, when you feel like your kid's kind of doing something that you haven't. And I can imagine it would be a little, threatening or scary feeling. So having to put the ego down.
I didn't really get that feedback. I remember when I was 14, I pulled my dad across the side and I said, Dad, is it going to be okay? Well, I think I maybe did it at 14 on a theological question. And then maybe when I was 18 or 19, and we had another conversation like this. And I said, is it going to be okay if I end up in a really different place than you?
Wow.
In what I think, and are we still going to be okay? Are we going to be cool? And he said, oh, absolutely.
That's awesome. Speaks so much to both of your hearts. Yeah. Okay. So you got
and we haven't ended up in a different place. They've watched me, and I would leave little books, send birthday presents, read this book. and we've had really good conversations, and they've embarked on their own adventure of re-educating themselves.
Mm-hmm. What do you love about what you're doing now, and what are you hoping to impart on the students you have? And what do you do with all this knowledge?
Yeah, hopefully I help students make sense of their world too. Some of the students that I receive are African-American students or Hispanic students who have really observed race and how it works in their community, but they haven't had the tools to analyze it. They haven't had the vocabulary. They haven't seen the studies. They have their personal experience. And what I'm able to do in class is to give them the history, the tools to look at race in their own lives, and to make better sense of what they've already seen. They've seen it. Now, why is it this way? Where did it come from? How have people dismantled systems of oppression in the past? What could I use? What has worked and not worked? And then there are also a lot of white students who I encounter who have been oblivious. They just have not been paying attention to the ways in which race shapes outcomes for people, that it limits their choices and limits their opportunities. They haven't noticed that. And of course, that's been by design, right? Part of what, how we've used white wealth and white privilege in this country has been able to remove ourselves from situations where we had to observe how race worked or to talk about it. So we always can absent ourselves from those conversations. We can move to another side of town, We can build huge highways that destroy Black neighborhoods that lead us out to suburbs where we can avoid having to look at the problems that our nation's policies have created. We can pull ourselves out. We can pull our kids out of the school systems. And so a lot of these kids don't know what's going on, but that's been by design. People have been hiding it from them. And so to help them see
Right.
what's going on is really helpful. And my hope is that what that does is it empowers a generation of people who want to do real community activism. It really helps students to say, okay, listen, I actually want to make different choices. I want to pay attention to what's happening in my local community, and I want to fight for issues of justice. I want to know what's happening in other communities. I maybe even want to make choices that lead me to have a less segregated life.
Okay, cool.
So usually the college students I have are often, they're experiencing the most racially integrated moment of their lives. And as they leave college, they if they're not paying attention, they will make choice after choice, which resegregates their lives. They will choose to live in certain neighborhoods, to take certain jobs, to put their kids in certain schools, to attend certain churches. And if you do that without thinking, the result is continually to choosing to live a life that's very segregated.
Yeah.
And so hopefully maybe giving them a framework that says, actually, when I leave college, I'm going to make the kind of choices that make my life more integrated, that make me more aware of what other people are doing in my community, and think about ways that I can use my position, my power, my influence, my work to make the community more just.
Right. You're a dad now too. How has this impacted how you raise your kids and what you want to expose them to, and how you want them to be change agents, positive change agents in the world? Because like nice white parents, talk about, it's kind of a different, you have ideals, but then you have kids, and you can get tempted, like you said, into going back into kind of that safe, quote, default mode. So how has it impacted
I do.
you?
I have a 14-year-old, I have an 11-year-old, and I have a 1-year-old.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Fun.
And it really has shaped a lot of the choices that we make as parents. We live in a integrated neighborhood it's integrated racially and socioeconomically. When we moved in, the renters next door didn't have hot water. And so my children were really aware and really grateful. We have a little tiny house, and sometimes we get grumpy and we complain about the size of our house. But our kids are like, yeah, but our neighbors come over here to wash their hair because they don't have hot water in their house. And I think that really helps the kids be really grateful. Wow, we've got a hot water heater.
Perspective.
Right? Yes, right. The town that we live in, Macon, is very economically and racially stratified. And most of the middle class and upper class white families have pulled out of the public school system. They pulled out when desegregation orders came down in the late 60s and early 70s, and they never returned. So it has meant things like my older daughter attended a middle school that was over 90% African American. Her final year, she was the only white student in her grade and class.
Wow.
So
how did she feel about that?
she's really good. She's really great about it. In fact, she was the school has a pageant to determine who are the public faces for the school, Mr. Miller and Miss Miller, and she was Miss Miller. She won Miss Miller. She was the ambassador for the school around. She has conversations with people about race all the time.
Yeah.
And she feels really called to what she's doing. She doesn't want us to pull her out and put her in private schools. She thinks that there's a real benefit to where she is and to what she has. Almost her entire friend group are African American. But that's been hard too. There's, because our social lives are not entirely African American. And she notices that connection. She goes to this youth group and everyone's Black, and to that youth group and everyone's white. And she has these friends who don't know those friends. And I think it can be isolating for her at times.
Sure.
But when my second daughter, when she was 4 when we moved to Macon, and we have public pre-K here. It's a pretty good program. And we had been in town just a couple of weeks, and I was dropping her off for her first day at preschool. And it's a cute little school, lots of little tiny sinks and little tiny toilets and everything, little tiny tables. The whole school was
That's
just
awesome.
for pre-K kids. Yeah. And it was so cute and adorable and a wonderful place. And we loved it. And I went to drop her off for her first day, and I realized that when I got there the first day, there were 18 kids in her class, and 2 of them were white and 16 of them were Black. And I froze in that moment. I think everything in my experience in life has told me that good neighborhoods are the neighborhoods that have a lot of white people in them, and good schools are the schools that have a lot of white people in them. And can I leave my kid in a school that's majority Black? It was sort of there was this knee-jerk reaction, and I had to remind myself, what makes me think this is not a good school?
Right.
I've met the teachers. I've seen what they do. I observed the classes. It's a wonderful place to leave my daughter. And what did I think 16 Black 4-year-olds were going to do? Where was this fear coming from?
Right. I understand. Yeah.
Right. And I realized I had been really, shaped. And despite all of my reading and all of my training, and I thought, God, if I have been studying this my entire life and I'm frozen by fear in this moment, I recognize how difficult these decisions are for parents. But she had a wonderful year there.
I appreciate you saying that, by the way. That's it's very honest and relatable and very grace-giving. So thank you for that. Yeah.
But later that year, we were talking at the table with some friends, and we were talking about race, which is a frequent topic of conversation at our house. And people were using the term majority and minority. And majority, they were talking about whites, and minorities, they were talking about non-white people. And my daughter stopped us, the 4-year-old stopped us and said, but most people in the world have dark skin.
Wow.
And I thought, well, you're exactly right. But how many white 4-year-old girls know that?
Right.
And she was just thinking about her class. She was watching her class and saying, yeah, most people have dark skin. I'm the exception. And I thought, well, that's an education that I couldn't get at the priciest private school in town. I couldn't get the sense of it. Yeah, most people in the world have dark skin. And my real hope is that when she drops her 4-year-old off, she won't have that same gut reaction that I had, that same fear, that somehow growing up in that kind of environment will be really beneficial to her.
What's advice that you would give, or maybe you have given to, white parents who have that heart, but maybe, have that moment of, what's your advice? Do you have advice, to parents?
Well, what I've said to other white parents here in Macon is to not pull out of the public school system out of fear.
Yeah. Let
the school system fail you. And when it's failed you, then pull out. But don't pull out because you think it will fail you. You've had these rumors, the racial makeup alarms you. Let yourself say, I'm not pulling out until it's failed me.
Yeah, that's really great advice. Probably could apply to a lot of areas in life.
Lots of areas in life, right? Don't leave the neighborhood as it integrates out of fear. Stay and say, I'm not leaving until something really has happened. I'm not going to leave until I know that this is bad for my family, because it could turn out to be good for your family.
Yeah. Well, looking at the future, do you see yourself staying in this vocation and doing this very long term, or?
I do. I tell you, I keep getting confirmed that I'm doing exactly what I was put on this earth to do. There is an integration in my life between the things that I teach, and the commitments that I have from my faith, and the life that my kids are leading and that we're leading as a family, the community that I'm in, everything seems to overlap.
Yeah.
So
That's
it's
cool.
really wonderful to be paid to talk about the things that I like to talk about, to read and to study them, to research them, but also to do community service along issues of racial justice, which is something I'd want to be doing anyway. But instead of that commitment pulling me away from my day job, it becomes part of my day job.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a blessing that I don't think a lot of people have.
Yeah.
That
That
I just feel like I can
overlaps.
bring my whole self to work, and it's so rewarding. I don't want to do anything else.
Yeah. Well, I love it, and I hope you keep doing what you're doing, because it's as you know, more needed maybe now than ever. I don't know, but it's definitely needed. So, yeah. Well, thank you, and I appreciate you coming on today.
Hey, well, thanks, Suzanne. I appreciate you having me. It's great to talk.
Yeah.